The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and by Wednesday morning, Wesley Brenner had already packed his single leather traveling bag, stuffed his best shirt inside it, and was standing at the door of his rented room in Kansas City with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face that his landlady, Mrs. Potts, would later describe as a man who had just been struck by lightning and found the whole experience agreeable. He had not even finished reading the letter. He had gotten as far as the second paragraph, the part where his cousin Nathaniel, who ran a dry goods store in the small town of Harlow Creek, New Mexico Territory, described the woman who lived on the neighboring homestead as the most obstinate, headstrong, contrary creature God ever breathed life into. And something in Wesley Brenner's chest had simply moved, the way a compass needle moves when it finds true north, and he had set the letter down on the table and begun to pack. His cousin had written 3 full pages about Celia Abbott, 3 pages detailing how she had argued with the town mayor about the placement of a new water trough and won, how she had refused to sell a single acre of the land her father had left her, even when the Callaway Land Company had sent 2 different men with 2 different offers that were, by any reasonable standard, more than fair. How she had shot a rattlesnake out from under the porch steps of the schoolhouse with a single rifle shot, while the schoolteacher stood frozen on the steps above, and then had simply gone back to whatever she had been doing without waiting for thanks. How she kept 5 horses, 2 of which no one else in the county could ride, and how she managed her own cattle, her own accounts, her own fences, and her own affairs without asking a single soul for assistance or permission. Nathaniel had clearly intended these as warnings. He had underlined the word difficult twice. Wesley had read it as a catalogue of wonders. He was 28 years old, a carpenter by trade, a man who had spent the last 4 years doing good solid work in Kansas City building cabinets, setting floors, framing houses for other people to fill with other people's lives, and all 4 of those years he had felt, in a quiet and persistent way that he could never quite articulate, that something was missing from the shape of his days. Not misery, nothing so dramatic. Just the sense that the world he was living in was perhaps a size too small for him. That there was somewhere larger he ought to be, something realer, something that would require more of him than measuring twice and cutting once. He finished reading the letter on the train, somewhere in the long dry stretch between the Oklahoma border and the New Mexico Territory, and he thought, not for the first time, about the woman his cousin had described with such exasperation and such inadvertent admiration. He thought about what kind of woman argued with mayors and won. What kind of woman refused to be bought out when every man around her was selling? What kind of woman went back to her work without waiting for anyone to notice what she had done? The kind, he thought, that would fill up a room without trying. The kind that would require something real from a man. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket and watched the desert roll past the window, red and gold and impossibly wide, and he felt, for the first time in 4 years, that the world was exactly the right size. Harlow Creek was smaller than he had imagined and more alive than he had expected. It sat in a shallow valley in the northern reaches of the New Mexico Territory, bracketed on one side by a range of low red mesas, and on the other by a creek that was still running clear this early in the spring. There were perhaps 300 people living in and around the town itself, a main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a church, and a handful of other establishments, and then the outlying homesteads and ranches spreading out across the valley floor for miles in every direction. Nathaniel met him at the stage depot, which was just a covered platform at the edge of town, and shook his hand with the look of a man who is genuinely glad to see someone and also slightly worried about what that someone might be about to do. "You made good time," Nathaniel said. "I did not waste any," Wesley agreed. "I got your telegram." Nathaniel picked up one of Wesley's bags. He was a stocky, good-natured man of 32 with red cheeks and a careful, assessing eye. "You said you were interested in building work. There's plenty of that. Harlow Creek has been growing. Good, Wesley said. He looked down the main street at the low adobe and timber buildings baking pleasantly in the afternoon sun. And the Abbott place, how far is that? Nathaniel stopped walking. He turned and looked at his cousin with an expression that mixed resignation and amusement in roughly equal parts. You haven't even put your bag down yet. I am just asking. You are just asking the same way a hunting dog is just sniffing the air. Nathaniel started walking again. About 2 miles east of town, you can see the roof line from the Mesa Road. But Wesley, I meant what I wrote. She is not a woman who makes things easy. Did I ask for easy? Nathaniel gave him a long sideways look. No, he admitted. I suppose you did not. Wesley spent his first 3 days in Harlow Creek, as he had told his cousin he intended to getting his bearings, meeting people, surveying the state of the buildings in town, and determining where his skills might be most in demand. He took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Garfield, who fed her boarders twice a day and required them to be in by 9 o'clock in the evening, a rule Wesley observed mostly because there was not, in those first days, anywhere else he particularly wanted to be after dark. He heard about Celia Abbott in pieces, from different people, in the way you hear about someone who is significant in a small community without quite being part of it. The blacksmith mentioned her in passing, said she had brought in all 5 of her horses for new shoes in March, and had specified exactly what weight of iron she wanted and why, and had been, apparently, correct about her reasons. The woman who ran the church auxiliary mentioned her with a complicated expression, said Miss Abbott donated money to the school fund every year without fail, but had not attended a church service in 2 years, since a disagreement with the reverend about something the woman declined to specify. The sheriff, a weathered man named Decker who had been in Harlow Creek for 12 years, mentioned her with straightforward respect, said she was the best shot in the county, male or female, and that she had never once caused him trouble in the legal sense, which was more than he could say for half the ranchers on the valley floor. Nobody described her the same way twice. But every description had the same quality underneath it, a kind of reluctant acknowledgement, the way people acknowledge the weather or the river or anything else that exists on its own terms regardless of what anyone thinks about it. On Thursday morning, Wesley saddled the horse he had borrowed from his cousin and rode east on the Mesa Road. The Abbott homestead announced itself before he could see it clearly, 3 horses moving in a corral, a windmill turning slowly in the dry air, the smell of wood smoke and hay. The house itself was adobe with a timber porch, solid and well-maintained, and someone had planted a kitchen garden on the south side that was already showing green in the March warmth. There were outbuildings, a barn, a small smokehouse, a structure that appeared to be a workshop of some kind, and the fences were all straight and sound. He dismounted at the gate and was still looping his reins over the post when he heard a voice from somewhere he could not immediately locate. The Callaway Land Company sent a man in February, the voice said, and another one in March. If you are the April installment, you can save yourself the ride back by turning around now. He looked up and found her. She was standing on the roof of the barn, which he had not noticed because he had not thought to look up, and she was holding a hammer with the easy authority of someone who uses one regularly, and she was looking down at him with an expression that was not hostile. It was too frank for hostility, but was entirely devoid of welcome. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair pulled back under a flat-brimmed hat, and she was wearing trousers, which was not, in his experience, something women in small towns typically did, and she did not look as though she expected him to have any feelings about it one way or the other. She was, he thought, exactly as described. She was also nothing like what he had imagined, and he had been imagining her for 2 weeks. I am not from the Callaway Land Company, he said. She waited, hammer still in hand. My name is Wesley Brenner. I am Nathaniel Cole's cousin. I have come to Harlow Creek for the building work. A pause. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not softening exactly, but a recalibration. "Nathaniel's cousin," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. She turned back to whatever she had been doing on the roof, which appeared to involve replacing a section of damaged shingles, and he stood at the gate for a moment before she said, without looking down, "The gate is not locked." He understood this as an invitation of the limited kind and opened the gate and came into the yard. He stood below the barn roof and looked up at her work, and after a moment he said, "You have a gap at the ridge line about 3 feet from the north end. The new shingles will not address it from where you are working." She stopped. She did not look at him, but she stopped. Then she moved 3 feet north and inspected the area he had described and said nothing for a moment, and then said, still without looking at him, "How do you see that from down there?" "I have been putting roofs on buildings for 6 years," he said. "You develop an eye." She was quiet again. Then she said, "There is a ladder on the east side of the barn." He found the ladder and climbed up, and for the next 2 hours they worked on the barn roof together without any preamble, without any social niceties, without any of the careful conversational circles that people usually drew around each other when they were strangers. She worked hard and she worked well and she did not talk much, but the talking she did was direct and purposeful, and when he made a suggestion, she considered it on its merits rather than on the basis of whether she had thought of it herself, and when she was right about something, which was often, she did not belabor the point. By the time they climbed down, the roof was solid and the gap was closed and the afternoon had gone golden with the approach of evening. She pulled off her work gloves and looked at the barn roof and then at him, and for the first time something in her expression shifted toward something that was not calculation or wariness but might in the right light have been called interest. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I did not ask for help." "No," he agreed again. "But you gave it anyway." "I saw work that needed doing," he said simply, "and I knew how to do it." She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, direct eyes. They were green, he noticed, a deep, steady green like the color of the creek in spring, and then she turned toward the house. "I have coffee on," she said, "if you want it." He wanted it. He stayed for coffee and then for supper, which she made without fuss and served without apology: salt pork and beans and corn bread, plain and filling and good. She asked him about his work in Kansas City, not with social interest but with the genuine technical curiosity of someone who builds and repairs things herself and wants to understand how other people approach the same problems. He answered her the same way, directly, specifically, without embellishment. When he left it was past dark and the stars were out in numbers that still startled him, coming from the city. He rode back to Harlow Creek thinking about the way she had moved on that roof, efficient and sure, without any of the self-conscious awareness that some people have when they are being watched, as though she had simply not considered the possibility that she ought to perform herself differently for an audience. He thought he had never in his life met anyone so entirely themselves. He went back the next Friday, and the Friday after that, and the one after that. There was always a reason. He had offered to look at the hinge on the barn door that she mentioned was sticking, and then there was a length of fencing on the north pasture that had been pushed over by a steer and needed to be straightened, and then there was the matter of the workshop windowsill that had rotted through over the winter. He was not manufacturing reasons. The homestead was real and working and large, and there was always, genuinely, work to be done, and she was one person doing all of it. She accepted his help with the same careful pragmatism she seemed to apply to everything, and she paid him in what she had, meals, and once a pound of excellent coffee she had ordered from a merchant in Santa Fe, and once the use of one of her horses for an afternoon when his borrowed one threw a shoe. She did not treat his help as charity, and he did not offer it as such, and this seemed to suit them both. Their conversations grew. Not warmer, exactly, or not only warmer, but deeper, more layered, more willing to go into territory that casual acquaintances do not usually visit. He learned that her father had come to the New Mexico territory from Tennessee in 1861. the year she was born, with very little money and very great determination, and had built the homestead from nothing in the space of 15 years, and had died of a fever 2 years ago, leaving everything to her, his only surviving child, because her mother had died when Celia was 7, and there was no one else. He learned that she had managed the place alone since then, which meant she had been managing it alone since she was 23, and that the Callaway Land Company had been after the property almost from the moment her father died, because the land sat over an aquifer that made it unusually valuable in a territory where water was the measure of everything. He learned that she had loved her father with a fierce, uncomplicated love that had not gone away just because he had, and that the homestead was not simply property to her. It was the accumulated work of his life and hers, and she would not see it absorbed by a land company whose only interest was in the water below the soil. She learned about him in turn, that he had grown up in Ohio, the son of a furniture maker, that he had learned his trade from his father and then outgrown the small shop and looked for larger things, that he had spent 4 years in Kansas City doing work that was solid and respectable, and had left him with the persistent feeling that he was capable of more than it required of him. She asked him once, very directly, in the way she asked most things, why he had come to Harlow Creek specifically, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "My cousin described the country," which was true as far as it went, and she accepted it with the slight narrowing of her eyes that meant she suspected there was more to it but was choosing not to press. April came on warm, and the valley floor turned a particular shade of gold green that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, and Wesley found that the days he did not ride east on the Mesa Road were flat in a way the days he did were not. He was building things in town. He had taken on the contract to frame the new addition to the schoolhouse, and there was talk of a second contract to build the doctor's office that the town had been planning for 2 years. He was good at his work, and people in Harlow Creek were, on the whole, fair-minded enough to recognize it, and he was beginning to feel the shape of a life here, a real one with edges and weight to it. But the center of it, the thing that gave it its gravity, was 2 miles east on the Mesa Road. He recognized this for what it was. He was not a man who lied to himself about things. He had been interested in Celia Abbott before he had ever seen her face, interested in the person his cousin had described with such baffled admiration. And every hour he had spent in her company since had deepened that interest into something that was no longer merely interest, that was something with more insistence to it. Something that sat in the chest and made its presence known in the early morning and the late evening, and at intervals throughout the day whenever he was not actively focused on something else. The question was what, if anything, to do about it. Celia Abbott was not, from everything he had seen, a woman who welcomed the conventional approach to these things. She was not a woman who would be charmed by flowers or flattered by compliments or moved by grand gestures. She was a woman who valued honesty and competence and directness, and he thought that if he tried to court her in the usual way, the tentative, indirect, socially prescribed way, she would see through it immediately and be annoyed by the indirection. He thought the honest thing was simply to tell her the truth. He told her in May, on a Saturday afternoon when they had finished repairing the stone wall around the kitchen garden, and were sitting on the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee and the last of the afternoon light slanting gold across the valley. He did not build up to it. He simply said, with the same directness she used for everything, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him with those level green eyes and waited. "I came to Harlow Creek because of you," he said. "Not only because of the building work, though the building work is real. I read my cousin's letter, the one where he described you, and I packed my bag before I finished reading it. I want you to know that." The silence that followed was considerable. He watched her face and saw several things move through it in quick succession: surprise, which she controlled almost immediately, and then something else that was harder to name, something wary and considering, and then an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was a kind of stillness, like the stillness before something decides which direction to move. "That is a peculiar thing to tell a woman," she said finally. "I imagine it is," he agreed. "You came here because of a letter you had not even finished reading." "Yes, based on descriptions of things that were not intended as recommendations." "No," he said, "they were not. But they were the most interesting account of a person I had ever read." She was quiet for a long time. She looked out across the valley at the mesas going red in the sunset, and her coffee cup was still in her hands, and her expression was not closed, he thought. Not closed, but careful. "I am not easy," she said at last, "in case that was not clear from the letter." "It was made very clear," he said. "That was one of the things that interested me." She looked at him then, a direct look that he had come to understand was her way of taking the full measure of something. "Why?" she said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical. She actually wanted to know. "Because easy," he said slowly, trying to find the right words for something he had only understood in pieces, "has a way of meaning not quite real. Easy means everyone agrees. Easy means there are no edges. I have been living an easy life for 4 years, and it has been like living in a room where all the furniture is pushed against the walls. Nothing to run into and nowhere to sit down." Something shifted in her face, minute but real. "And you think I am furniture?" she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite humor. She was too dry for humor exactly, but was adjacent to it. "I think you are the whole room," he said, and meant it, and she heard that he meant it. She looked away again. The silence stretched out, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of someone who is thinking seriously about something, and he waited without crowding it. "I have been managing this place for 2 years alone," she said finally. "I have gotten used to it, to making decisions alone. To not accommodating another person's expectations of how things should be done or how I should." She stopped, started again. "I am telling you this so you understand what you are saying you are interested in." "I understand," he said. "I am not sure you do." "Then I will learn it by staying," he said. "If you will permit me to." Another silence. And then she said, still not looking at him, "I am not saying no." That was in May. June arrived, and with it, the real heat of the New Mexico summer, and the story of what was developing between Celia Abbott and Wesley Brenner became something that Harlow Creek took notice of in the particular way that small towns take notice of things, with interest, with opinion, and with a fair amount of commentary that neither of the parties involved had asked for. The commentary was not all kind. There were people in town who thought Celia Abbott was peculiar, and who had always found her refusal to sell the homestead or conform to expectations of what a young woman alone ought to do with herself as either brave or foolish, depending on the speaker's disposition. There were people who thought that Wesley Brenner, being a newcomer, could not possibly understand what he was getting into, and who felt a certain duty to warn him. The Reverend, with whom Celia had her 2-year disagreement, mentioned in a Sunday sermon that stubbornness in a woman was a quality that required careful handling, which was widely understood as a comment on the specific situation. Wesley received these opinions with a politeness that was entirely impenetrable. He thanked people for their concern and then continued doing exactly what he had been doing, which was riding east on the Mesa Road every Friday and Saturday, and by June, most Sundays as well. He and Celia did not discuss, in those early months, what they were to each other in any formal sense. They worked together and talked together and ate together and sat together in the evenings on the porch watching the stars come out over the valley. And the thing between them grew the way things grow in good soil, without drama, without announcement, but with a steadiness that had the quality of something that intends to last. The first time he held her hand was entirely accidental. They had both reached for the same tool at the same moment, and his hand closed over hers before either of them had planned it, and neither of them pulled back immediately, and the moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds longer than accident would explain. When they did separate, he did not comment on it, and neither did she, but something had shifted between them, the way the temperature shifts in the hour before sunrise, barely perceptible but changing everything. The first time he touched her face was not accidental. It was a Thursday evening in the middle of June, and they were sitting on the porch, and she had been telling him about a problem with one of the northern fence lines, a section that kept failing, and she had not been able to determine why. And she had been talking with the concentrated energy she brought to every problem, and in the middle of a sentence she had stopped and looked at him with a slight frown and said, "You are not listening to the fence problem." And he had said, "No," and reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, and she had gone very still. They looked at each other for a long moment. "Wesley," she said, and his name in her mouth sounded different than it did anywhere else, had a different weight. "Yes," he said, "I am." She stopped, tried again. "I do not know how to do this. I want you to know that. I have been on my own for a long time, and I do not know how to." Another stop. Her jaw was set in the way he had come to recognize as her working through difficulty, not retreating from it. "I am not saying I do not want to. I am saying I am not practiced at it." "Neither am I," he said, "not in the way that matters." She looked at him, trying to determine if he meant it, which was something she always did. She never took things at face value, she always checked, and he had come to respect this rather than resent it. "All right," she said finally, quietly. "All right," he agreed, and that was, in its way, everything. July brought the full desert heat and also trouble, in the form of a third representative from the Callaway Land Company, a man named Aldrich, well-dressed and smooth-mannered, who appeared in Harlow Creek on a Monday morning and spent 2 days talking to various people in town, before riding out to the Abbott homestead on Wednesday. Wesley heard about Aldrich's presence in town from Nathaniel, who had spoken with him at the general store, and who came to find Wesley at the schoolhouse construction site with an expression of straightforward concern. "He is not the same kind of man as the ones they sent before," Nathaniel said. "He is the kind they send when the previous kind does not work." Wesley set down his framing hammer. "What kind is that?" "The kind with lawyers." Wesley rode east that afternoon without waiting for Friday. He found Celia in the yard, speaking with Aldrich, who was a tall man of perhaps 40 in a brown suit with an air of practiced reasonableness. Celia was standing with her arms crossed, and her expression was the specific kind of flat that Wesley had learned, meant she was not going to yield a single inch on whatever was being discussed, but was keeping herself entirely controlled about it. Wesley dismounted and came into the yard, and Aldrich turned to look at him with the assessing eye of a man who catalogues people quickly. "Mr. Brenner," Celia said, and there was something in the way she used his name, formal but deliberate, like she was drawing a line, that told him she was not in distress but would not object to his presence. He nodded to her and then looked at Aldrich without any particular expression. "Afternoon." Aldrich introduced himself and explained, with the careful fluency of a man who had made this particular speech many times, that the Callaway Land Company was prepared to make a significantly improved offer for the Abbott property, that the offer included provisions for Miss Abbott's continued residence in the territory, that the company was not unsympathetic to the sentimental dimensions of the situation, but that the practical dimensions were also worth considering. Given the costs of maintaining a working homestead alone, Wesley listened to all of this without interruption. When Aldrich finished, Wesley said, "Did she say she wanted to hear the offer?" Aldrich blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Miss Abbott, did she indicate at any point in this conversation that she was interested in hearing what the company is prepared to offer?" A slight pause. "The conversation was proceeding because," Wesley continued in the same level tone, "if she had not indicated interest, then what you are doing is not making an offer. It is applying pressure to a woman on her own property, which is a different thing." Aldrich's reasonable expression had developed a slight crack in it. "I assure you, sir, that the company's intentions are entirely above." "I am sure they are," Wesley said. "And when Miss Abbott wants to hear them, she will tell you so. Until that time, I think you have probably had a long enough ride today." There was a moment, the particular moment of a man calculating whether the confrontation is worth the cost. And then Aldrich touched his hat to Celia with the smooth politeness of someone who has not given up but has decided to step back, and rode out. The yard was quiet. Celia uncrossed her arms. She looked at Wesley for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and something more complicated. "I could have handled that," she said. "I know," he said. "I did not do it because you could not. I did it because you should not have to do it alone." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a very specific distinction." "Yes," he said. Another pause. Then she turned toward the house and said, "Come inside, I have lemonade." He followed her in, and the afternoon settled around them, and he thought that this specifically, this capacity to stand beside rather than in front of, to help without displacing, was the thing he had been trying to find a language for since May, and he thought he was getting closer to having the words for it. Aldrich came back 3 more times over the course of July. Each time he came with a revised offer, and each time Celia declined it. And each time Wesley was present not because she needed him to be, but because the situation had a quality of accumulating pressure that he did not like, and he would not leave her to bear it entirely alone. On the 3rd visit, Aldrich made a comment, oblique but deliberate, about the legal complications that could arise when a single woman attempted to hold a property against a company with sufficient resources to contest the title. And Wesley stood up from the porch step and said, very quietly, that he thought it would be wise for Aldrich to be very careful about the distinction between making business propositions and making threats. After Aldrich left that time, Celia sat on the porch for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "My father filed the title in 1875. It is clear. There is no dispute." "I know," Wesley said. "I am not afraid of them." "I know that too," he said. "But it is worth having someone in town who knows what they are doing." "A lawyer, you mean?" "I mean someone who knows the land law in the territory." She thought about this. She was pragmatic enough, when she had time to think, to recognize good counsel even when accepting it cost her something. "The sheriff would know who to speak to," she said finally. "Sheriff Decker strikes me as a man who knows most things worth knowing in this county," Wesley agreed. She gave him the sideways look that meant she had noticed. He had guided her toward a conclusion without pushing her to it. He met her eyes without apology, and after a moment she turned away. But there was something at the corner of her mouth that was the nearest thing to a smile he had yet seen from her, and it made his chest do something complicated. They went to see Sheriff Decker together the following Monday, and Decker directed them to a lawyer in Santa Fe who had handled title disputes in the territory before. And by the end of August, the situation had been thoroughly documented, and the Callaway Land Company's legal position had been reviewed and found to be exactly as weak as Celia had always maintained it was. Aldrich did not come back after August. The threat, when it was over, left behind a particular quality of relief, not the dramatic kind but the quiet, settling kind, like a door that has been standing open in a draft finally coming properly closed. September came in with cooler nights and the smell of autumn in the high desert, and the thing between Wesley and Celia had become, by this point, something that Harlow Creek recognized without discussion. They were seen together in town on Saturdays, which was the day Wesley came in from the homestead in the morning, and Celia often came in to do her weekly errands, and they had a habit of coinciding at the general store and walking together down the main street. And this was observed and commented upon in the way that things are observed and commented upon in small towns, which is to say, broadly and with feeling. Mrs. Garfield at the boarding house told Wesley at breakfast one morning in September that Celia Abbott was a good woman even if she was not easy, and that she hoped he understood the difference between not easy and not good. He told her he did. Mrs. Garfield looked at him over her coffee cup and said, "I hope so, Mr. Brenner. I truly do," in a way that suggested she was allowing herself to be cautiously hopeful. Nathaniel, who had started the whole enterprise without quite meaning to, had the expression of a man who has thrown a stone into a pond and is somewhat awestruck by the size of the ripples. He and Wesley sat on the porch of the general store one evening and Nathaniel said, "I wrote that letter to warn you off." "I know," Wesley said. "And you read it as an invitation." "I read it as an honest account," Wesley said. "Which it was. You described her exactly." Nathaniel shook his head slowly. She is going to drive you mad, Wesley." "Probably," Wesley agreed cheerfully. "But I suspect I will also know exactly why everything I am doing is wrong, which is useful in a person." Nathaniel laughed despite himself. "She is that specific," he admitted. "She will tell you very precisely what is incorrect and she will be right." "Good," Wesley said. There was a long, comfortable pause while both men watched the main street in the gathering dusk, and then Nathaniel said, in a different tone, "She has been alone for a long time, you know, since her father. She has built something very self-contained, and I do not know that she knows how to." "She is learning," Wesley said quietly. "And so am I." The first time Wesley told Celia he loved her was in October, on a morning when the sky had gone that particular crystalline blue that comes to the high desert in autumn, and they were riding together across the northern pasture to check the fence line that had been giving her trouble. They had finally determined that a section of the ground was shifting seasonally, swelling in wet weather and contracting in dry. And they were going to install a different kind of post anchor that would accommodate the movement. They had been riding for about 20 minutes in a comfortable silence, the kind that had taken months to build and now felt like its own form of intimacy. And the light was doing something extraordinary across the red mesas to the east, and Wesley looked at her, her profile against that sky, her hat brim throwing a shadow across her cheek, her hands easy on the reins of a horse that no one else could ride, and said it. Not dramatically, not with preparation. Just said it the way he said most things to her, because not saying it would have been a kind of lying. "I love you, Celia." She did not look at him immediately. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead, and he watched her jaw, which moved slightly in the way it did when she was working through something, and then she pulled her horse to a stop and turned to face him. Her eyes were very green in that morning light. "I have been thinking about what it means to say that," she said. "For a while now, what it requires of a person, what it changes." He waited. "I have been afraid of it," she said, and this was, he understood, an enormous admission from her. A woman who was afraid of almost nothing she could put her hands on, afraid of a feeling. "Not of you. I want to be clear about that. Not of you specifically, of what it means to need someone. To build things that include another person." "I understand that," he said. "You said that before when I told you I did not know how to do this," she said. "That you understood, and you have." She stopped. Her hands tightened on the reins and then released. "You have not pushed. You have been exactly what you said you would be, which is present without being, without requiring me to be different. And I did not know that a person could do that. I did not have evidence of it." "You have evidence of it now," he said. "Yes," she said, "I do." A pause. "Wesley, yes. I love you too," she said. "I am not practiced at saying it, but it is true." He looked at her and she looked at him, there in the middle of that pasture with the autumn sky above them, and the mesas going red and gold in every direction. And the moment had the quality of something that is settling into permanence, that has found its proper place in the world and intends to stay there. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she let him, and then she squeezed once, brief and sure, and turned her horse back toward the fence line, and he followed, and they rode on together. He asked her to marry him in November. On the evening, he had fixed the last loose board on the kitchen floor, which had been squeaking every time anyone stepped on it, and which she had mentioned twice, and which he had therefore been noting as something to address. He finished the last nail and stood up, and she was in the doorway looking at the floor with the expression of practical satisfaction that she wore when a problem had been correctly solved. And he said, "Celia," and when she looked at him he said, "I want to marry you. I want to live here and work here and build a life here with you, on your terms and mine together, if those terms can be agreed upon. I am not asking you to need me or to become something different from what you are. I am asking if you would be willing to have me alongside. The kitchen was very quiet. The window was dark with November evening. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it, not the feeling, he thought, because the feeling had been established, but the practical and emotional architecture of what he was proposing, what it would mean, what it would require, whether she trusted it. She had spent 2 years building self-sufficiency into her bones the way you build it into a foundation. Because she had to, because there was no other option, because the alternative was to be overcome by the scale of what she had been left with. He understood this. He had watched it all year, the way she had assembled herself into someone who needed nothing from anyone, and he knew that what he was asking was not small. He was asking her to dismantle a part of that, not the competence, not the independence, not the self-determination, but the isolation, the part that said no one else's presence was reliable. Yes, she said, simple, direct, entirely her. Yes, she said again, as if confirming it for herself, on the condition that you understand what you are agreeing to. Tell me, he said. This is my land, she said, my father's and mine. It does not become yours in the way the law makes it a husband's by default. I need you to understand that and to mean it. I understand it, he said, and I mean it. I make my own decisions about the cattle and the crops and the horses. I know, he said. And I make my own decisions about the building work. And when we disagree about something that affects us both, we talk about it until we have arrived at the right answer. That is the only arrangement I am interested in. She considered this. Then she said, that is reasonable. Good, he said. She crossed the newly fixed kitchen floor without it making a single sound and stood in front of him close and looked up at his face for a moment, and he could see everything she did not have words for yet moving in those green eyes, and then she put her hand against his chest, above his heart, and left it there. He covered her hand with his. They were married in December, in the church in Harlow Creek, in what was agreed by general consensus afterward to be the most characteristically Celia Abbott wedding that anyone could have designed. She wore a dress she had made herself, plain wool in a deep blue, and she walked down the aisle alone, having declined the various offers to be escorted. And when the Reverend asked if anyone had reason to object, she looked around the room with an expression that made everyone who had ever thought about objecting to anything she did reconsider immediately. And the ceremony was brief and direct, and the vows she and Wesley had written together were specific and honest, and contained nothing they had not already said to each other in the kitchen of the homestead in November. When they left the church, the whole of Harlow Creek, it seemed, was standing on the main street in the December cold, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a second one, and Mrs. Garfield had organized a gathering at the boarding house with food and dancing that went until midnight. Wesley danced with Celia, which was a revelation. He had not known she could dance, and she had not known he could either, and the discovery of this mutual competence, found in an unexpected place, delighted them both in a way that felt like a small portrait of what their life together was going to be. The winter settled in properly after Christmas, and with it settled the new life they were making together. Wesley moved into the homestead. They had agreed on this, that the homestead was its own logic, and it made more sense for him to come to it than to try to split their lives between it and some rented place in town. And he set up his tools in the workshop, and established a working arrangement with a contractor in Harlow Creek, who subcontracted him for jobs in town and the surrounding valley. Living together was not, they had both known it would not be, without friction. They had been formed by very different experiences into very different shapes, and the business of fitting those shapes together was the real work of the first months, the work that happened in the spaces between the larger things. They disagreed, specifically and sometimes heatedly, about the north pasture. She wanted to expand the cattle operation, and he thought the water situation made that risky. and they argued about it on and off through January with the genuine argumentativeness of two people who are both completely certain they are right. And in the end, they arrived at a compromise that was actually better than either of their original positions, which they both acknowledged without particularly enjoying the acknowledgement. They disagreed about a man named Portillo who came to Wesley with a building contract that he thought was above board and she thought smelled wrong, and she proved to be right about this, which she did not belabor but which he did not forget. They discovered, in the particular intimacy of shared daily life, each other's edges in ways that courtship does not always reveal, that she was capable, under enough accumulated pressure, of a silence that had temperature to it, that he had a stubbornness of his own that came out sideways when he was feeling crowded, that they both had a tendency, when they were frightened about something, to become very practical and efficient as a defense mechanism, which sometimes meant they were both dealing with the same fear from opposite ends of it without talking about it. They got better at this. Slowly and with effort, and with the willingness to come back to a thing after stepping away from it and try again. There were also, and Wesley had known there would be, but the knowing had not prepared him for the experiencing, the mornings when he came downstairs and found her already out in the barn at first light, the evenings when the valley went all gold and pink, and they sat on the porch together without speaking, because there was nothing that needed saying, the days when a thing that had been difficult became easy, because two people were doing it instead of one, the quiet accumulating weight of being known by someone. Being known in the way that only happens when you live side by side with a person through the ordinary days. He had told her in October that the life he had been living before he came here had felt like a room where the furniture was pushed to the walls. Now the furniture was in the middle of the room, and there were things to run into, and there was somewhere to sit down, and the whole arrangement was complicated and occasionally chaotic, and he would not have traded a single inch of it. Spring came back around, and with the spring came the news confirmed in March, received by Celia with the composure she brought to everything and by Wesley with an expression that Mrs. Garfield, who heard about it from Nathaniel, later described as a man who had been handed something he had not quite believed was real until he was holding it. A child. Due in the autumn. Celia's approach to pregnancy was thoroughly consistent with her approach to everything else. She continued doing what she had always done, which was the work, and she made adjustments when adjustments were necessary and not before, and she declined to be treated as an invalid or an occasion for excessive concern. She also, in quieter moments, was warmer than she had been when he had first known her, in ways that were small and specific, and that he treasured precisely because they were not performed for anyone. The way she found his hand in the dark, the way she leaned back against him sometimes in the evenings when she was tired, the way she said his name in the morning with a different quality than she used it at any other time of day. He built things for the child. He could not help it. He built a cradle from pine and oak, sanded smooth and joined without a single nail, held together entirely by the fit of the wood, and it took him 3 weeks, and he was pleased with it in the way he was pleased with his best work. Not with pride exactly, but with the satisfaction of a thing done right. He built a cabinet for the baby's things, small and solid, with wooden pulls he had turned himself on a lathe he had set up in the workshop. He repaired and reinforced the floor of the room that would be the nursery, which had been her father's study, and rehung the door so it swung true and quiet. Celia watched all of this with a particular expression that he had come to recognize as the one she wore when she was moved by something, and was not going to mention it directly but did not bother to conceal it either. Once she ran her hand along the side of the cradle, a single slow stroke, and said nothing, and he said nothing either, and the moment had the quality of something completed. He also, in the summer, took her out to the northern mesa on a day in July when she was 7 months along, and the world had that quality of permanence it gets in high summer, and they sat on a flat rock above the valley and looked out over everything. The homestead below them, the creek catching the light, the town 2 miles west, the whole wide valley surrounded by its red mesas, and he said, "This is what I packed my bag for. I want you to know that. Not the specific thing, because I could not have imagined the specific thing, but this kind of real, this much to stand next to." She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the valley, and then she said, "You are going to make me say something that I will want to deny later." He laughed, and she laughed, which was still the thing that surprised him most, not that she could laugh, but that he could make her, that the laughter lived there waiting. "Tell me anyway," he said. She looked at him with those steady green eyes and said, "I am glad Nathaniel writes long letters." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, which was a gesture he had made so many hundreds of times that it was now entirely unconscious, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, which was a gesture she had never made consciously at all, but had simply grown into the way a vine grows toward light, and they sat on the mesa above the valley in the July sun, and below them, the land that was hers and the life that was there spread out in every direction they could see. The baby came in September, a boy. He arrived with considerable noise and opinion, which Celia bore with the focused intensity she brought to difficult things, and when it was done and the doctor had confirmed that everything was as it should be, she held the baby against her chest with both arms and looked down at him with an expression Wesley had never seen on her face before. Not soft, exactly, because she was not exactly a soft person, but open. As though something she had been holding carefully in check had simply opened up all at once, and there was nothing to do but let it. He was sitting beside her, and she turned and looked at him over the baby's head, and her eyes were very bright, and she said, very quietly, "Wesley." "Yes," he said. "Look at him." He looked. The baby was red-faced and frowning and appeared to have a great deal to say about his current situation, and he was the most extraordinary thing Wesley had ever seen in his life. "He is," Wesley started. "Yes," Celia said. "They named him James after her father." James Abbott Brenner turned out to have his mother's temperament in the most precise ways, opinionated, direct, physically fearless, and possessed of a very clear sense of what he wanted, and a very vigorous means of expressing it when he did not have it. He had Wesley's coloring, dark blonde hair and brown eyes, but the expression was entirely Celia's, that particular look of someone who has assessed a situation and formed a firm opinion about it. Celia took to motherhood the way she took to everything else, seriously, competently, and on her own terms. She nursed James while reviewing her cattle records. She strapped him to her back in a carrier she had made from a Navajo blanket she had traded for at the market in Santa Fe, and went about the homestead business while he slept against her spine. She talked to him the way she talked to Wesley, directly and honestly, explaining things that he was far too young to understand in a tone that assumed he would understand them when the time came. Wesley watched all of this and loved her so thoroughly that it was indistinguishable from the air he breathed. Harlow Creek in 1883 and 1884 was growing, and with the growth came the complications of growth, more people, more competing interests, more of the particular kind of friction that comes when a place is in the process of becoming something different from what it was. The Callaway Land Company had retreated, but had not, as it turned out, given up entirely on the valley. They had shifted their attention to other properties, other water sources, and there were people in town who were selling land they had held for years, not because they were threatened, but because the prices had become genuinely significant. Celia and Wesley had a long conversation about this in the spring of 1884, when James was 6 months old, and the valley was in full bloom, and the world seemed, from the porch of the homestead, to be in an uncomplicated and generous mood. Celia sat in the rocking chair with James on her knee, and Wesley sat on the porch step, and they talked for 2 hours about what they wanted the next 10 years to look like, and the conversation was careful and serious and full of the specific weight of people who are not talking about abstractions, but about the actual shape of their lives. She was not going to sell. He had not thought she would, but he had wanted to talk it through so that the decision was made together and out loud rather than assumed. The homestead was viable. It had always been viable. She had made it viable through 2 years of very hard work and very careful management, and now with 2 of them the margin had widened somewhat. The cattle were doing well. The building contracts were steady. What they decided in the course of that 2-hour conversation was that they would expand not by buying more land, which neither of them was especially interested in, but by building up a second workshop larger, where Wesley could take bigger jobs. A proper root cellar so they would not lose produce to the late frosts. Eventually, in a few years, another room on the house. They had also decided, somewhere in the middle of that conversation, that they wanted more children. This was said in the matter-of-fact way they said most things to each other, and it had the quality of something that had been obvious for a while and simply needed saying out loud. The second baby, a daughter this time, who arrived in the winter of 1885, they named Frances, after Wesley's grandmother, a choice that Celia made with the precise intentionality she brought to all meaningful decisions. Frances was different from James in almost every particular calm where James had been insistent, observant where he had been demonstrative. But she had her mother's eyes, green and assessing, and from very early on she had the quality of someone who is quietly keeping track of everything. By the time Frances was born, the homestead had taken on the texture of a life fully inhabited, not the careful, provisional life that Celia had been living alone, but a life with depth and multiple layers, with the noise of children and the smell of good food and the sound of building work and the sound of cattle, and the sound of 2 people talking through their days and their disagreements and their love for each other in the kitchen and on the porch, and in the evening and first thing in the morning. It was not a quiet life. It was not an uncomplicated life. Nothing about Celia had ever made it likely to be either of those things, and Wesley, who had packed his bag before he finished reading a letter about a woman described as difficult and headstrong, had known that from the beginning. He had known it and packed his bag anyway. James learned to walk in the spring, and immediately applied this new capability to a program of thorough investigation of every potentially dangerous thing in the vicinity, which required the same quality of vigilant attention from his parents that the cattle and the fences and the building work required, with the additional complication that the cattle, at least, could be contained by a fence. James Abbott Brenner could not be contained by any fence that had yet been invented, and his parents discovered this about him with the mixture of exhaustion and pride that is the particular experience of raising a child who is constitutionally incapable of being deterred. One afternoon in May, when James was 18 months old and Frances was 4 months, and Celia was in the barn and Wesley was in the workshop, James got through the kitchen gate, they never established exactly how, and was found sitting in the corral with the 2 difficult horses, both of whom were standing in the middle of the enclosure looking down at him, with expressions of horses who are uncertain what to do with this development. Wesley found him there, having conducted a rapid search of the entire homestead in approximately 4 minutes, and the relief that hit him when he found the boy unharmed was so complete and physical that he had to stand still for a moment with his hand on the fence post. He picked James up and James said this was one of his early words, horse, with satisfaction, as though he had achieved something. Yes, Wesley agreed, his heart returning to its normal position. Horse. He told Celia that evening, and she listened with the focused intensity she gave to all accounts of near misses where their children were concerned, and then she said, "He is going to ride before he is 3. It was not a complaint. It was an assessment. We need to start him properly. You are going to teach him," Wesley said. "Who else?" she said. He looked at her, this woman who had been described as difficult and headstrong in every letter, who had shot rattlesnakes off schoolhouse steps and argued with mayors and refused to be bought out and managed a homestead alone for 2 years and built a life entirely on her own terms, and thought that was the most obvious answer in the world. "No one else," he agreed. She started James on horseback in the summer, with the same patience and specificity she brought to any skill, and he was fearless in the way she had expected, and she was careful in the way he had come to rely on. And by September of that year, James Abbott Brenner was riding a gentle mare named Clara around the corral with an expression of complete and solemn authority. The town of Harlow Creek held an end-of-year gathering that autumn, as it did every year, a harvest celebration that took up the whole main street on a Saturday in October, with food and music and the general participation of most of the valley. Wesley and Celia came into town for it, which they did not always do for social events but which they had decided together they would try to do more often, partly because Harlow Creek was their community, and partly because Celia had been working for 2 years at being less systematically apart from it. It was not a natural thing for her. She was not a natural joiner of things. But she had decided it was worth the effort, and when Celia decided something was worth the effort, she made the effort without half measures. She stood in the main street with Francis on her hip and James holding her hand, and had a genuine conversation with the Reverend, with whom she had made a careful peace the previous winter. Not on the specific point of their disagreement 2 years ago, because neither of them was going to move on that, but on the larger point of being members of the same community with an interest in each other's well-being, which they both could agree to. She talked with the women from the church auxiliary about the school fund. She had always given to it, and she had opinions about how it should be used. And she talked with the blacksmith about iron grades and with the sheriff about a boundary dispute that had been causing friction between 2 of the valley ranches. And she was, throughout, completely and identifiably herself. Not softened, not performed, not adjusted. Herself. Wesley watched her from across the street, where he was talking with Nathaniel and the contractor and a rancher from the South Valley, and he thought again what he had thought the first afternoon he saw her on the barn roof, that she was exactly as described and nothing like what he had imagined, and that both of these things were equally true and equally remarkable. Nathaniel followed his gaze and said, "She looks," he stopped. "What?" Wesley said. "Easier," Nathaniel said thoughtfully. "Not easy. But the way she stands there, she looks like she is not carrying it all alone." "She is not," Wesley said. "No," Nathaniel agreed, and he said it with the warmth of a man who is genuinely glad of a thing. And then he clapped Wesley on the shoulder, and they went back to their conversation. The music started in the evening when the torches were lit along the main street, and this time Wesley did not wait for an opportunity to dance with Celia. He came across the street and held out his hand, and she gave James to Nathaniel, who accepted this responsibility with the expression of a man who has been surprised by it but is not unhappy about it, and she put Francis in the arms of Mrs. Garfield, who took her with the authority of a woman who has been wanting to hold that baby for the better part of 4 months, and then she took his hand. They danced in the firelight on the main street of Harlow Creek, with the autumn stars coming out above the valley and the music sliding between fast and slow and the whole community around them. And she was something. She was entirely herself, and she was with him, and these 2 things, which might have seemed contradictory once, were not contradictory at all. They were the same thing. They had always been the same thing. He pulled her a little closer in a slower song, and she let him, and she tilted her head back to look at his face, and the firelight was doing something beautiful to her, and he said, "Are you glad you said yes?" "That is a terrible question," she said. "Is it?" "Yes, because if I say yes you will be insufferably pleased with yourself. And if you say no, I would not say no," she said with finality. "Then you are glad." Wesley. The way she said his name, that particular weight. "I am so glad," she said quietly, not as an admission so much as a statement of fact, the way she stated all facts, directly and without apology. "I did not know I could not have told you in October when you rode out for the first time that I was going to be glad. I would have told you then that I was going to be cautious, that I was going to be careful. But this," she paused, "this is the thing I did not know I was building toward, through all of it, the whole time." He looked at her in the firelight with the music around them and the stars coming out overhead and the sound of the valley at celebration, and he thought, This is what I packed my bag for. This specific thing. This woman in the firelight, in a place she built with her own hands, telling me in her own direct and particular and irreplaceable way that she loves me without using the word. I know, he said. Do you? She said. I know, he said again, and he did. They danced until Frances began to make known from Mrs. Garfield's arms across the street that she had opinions about the hour, and then they collected their children and said their good nights and drove the wagon east on the Mesa Road toward the homestead. The night was cold and clear, and James had fallen asleep against Celia's side in the time it took to load the wagon, and Frances was bundled against the cold and watching the stars with the focused attention that was entirely characteristic of her. And the Mesa Road ran straight between the dark shapes of the desert landscape with the stars overhead in their millions. Wesley drove and Celia sat beside him with James warm and heavy against her, and she said, after a while, I have been thinking about something. What? He said. The workshop, she said. There is enough room if we extend the north wall by 12 feet to put in a second workbench and organize it properly. You are doing more work now than the current space accommodates well. He thought about this. She was right, he had been working around the space for months. 12 feet, he said. Possibly 14, she said. I measured it last week. Of course you did, he said, and he was smiling. Is that a yes? That is a yes, and also a comment about how you measured my workshop while I was not looking. It was also my workshop before it was yours, she pointed out. That is entirely true, he said. She settled back and James shifted in his sleep, making a small sound and then settling again, and Frances had decided the stars were satisfactory and closed her eyes, and the wagon rolled on toward home. Wesley, she said. Yes. Thank you for coming, she said. It was simple and direct, and she meant it in every sense. Thank you for coming to the homestead that first Thursday. Thank you for climbing the barn roof. Thank you for staying through May and July and November and December and all the months after. Thank you for packing the bag. Thank you for not running me off, he said, equally simple. She made a small sound that was both acknowledgement and amusement, and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder in that gesture she had grown into, and they rode on together toward the lights of the homestead which were visible now in the dark of the valley. He had built a new lantern post outside the door in the summer, which he had done because he did not like the idea of her coming home in the dark to an unlighted yard. And she had accepted this improvement without comment, and had been the first to light it every evening since. The homestead stood solid and real in the dark valley. The house and the barn and the workshop and the kitchen garden, everything they had built together and everything she had built before, all of it one continuous thing now, carrying both of their histories forward. He helped her get the children inside and settled James into his bed without fully waking Frances into the cradle, the one Wesley had built from pine and oak, the one that was joined without nails. And then they sat for a while at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low between them and drank the last of the evening's coffee, which was the habit they had developed in the first winter and had not broken since. She had papers on the table, accounts, records, the perpetual administration of the homestead, and she looked at them and then at him and said, "In the morning." "In the morning," he agreed. She put the papers aside and they sat in the warm kitchen in the low lamplight, and the house was quiet around them, the particular quiet of children sleeping, and outside the valley was dark and the stars were out and the world was exactly the size it ought to be. He reached across the table and she put her hand in his without looking up from her coffee cup, and he held it, and she held his, and the kitchen lamp burned low and steady, and the house kept its warmth against the October night. 2 years later, on a spring morning when the valley was in bloom and James was 4 years old and Frances was 2, and Celia was 4 months along with a third child that was making its presence known in the decisive way that all of her children seemed to approach everything, Wesley came out of the workshop to find James standing in the yard with a small wooden toy horse that Wesley had carved for him, narrating something to Frances with great intensity while she sat in the dirt, and listened with her characteristic focused attention. Celia was in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the turned earth, and she had her hat pushed back and her hands in the soil, and she looked up at the sound of him coming across the yard and said, "The seedlings are ready for the south bed." "I will get the wheelbarrow," he said. She looked at him with those green eyes in the spring light and said, "You do not have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." She gave him the particular look that still, after 3 years, undid him completely. That assessing, certain look that meant she saw him clearly and found exactly what she was looking for. And then she turned back to her garden, and he went to get the wheelbarrow, and the children played in the yard, and the spring morning continued around them in all its abundance. James at 4 had already made good on his mother's prediction, and was riding Clara in the pasture with a skill that made the ranch hands who came through the valley watching him with something between admiration and disbelief. He had also begun asking questions about every single thing in his observable universe, with an urgency that suggested he considered ignorance a personal affront, and Wesley answered them all with the seriousness they deserved, because he had watched Celia answer them that way and understood why. Frances at 2 had developed a system of watching, and then doing that was entirely her own. She would observe a thing with perfect patience for as long as it took to understand it, and then she would attempt it herself with a confidence that was either going to serve her very well or cause her a great deal of trouble, and Wesley suspected, based on the available evidence of her parentage, that the answer was probably both. The new baby, when it arrived in October of that year, was another boy. They named him Robert, after no one in particular, just because it suited him, and he arrived into a household that received him with complete and uncomplicated welcome. James with the authority of a 4-year-old who has opinions about younger siblings. Frances with the observational intensity that characterized her approach to everything. And Celia and Wesley with the experienced steadiness of parents who have been here before and know what is coming and are glad of it. Wesley, rocking Robert in the kitchen on a November evening while Celia slept. She had been awake for most of 2 days, and he had told her in the firmest terms he possessed that she was going to sleep, and she had been too tired to argue, which was the clearest evidence of her exhaustion. Thought about the letter. He still had it, the letter his cousin had written, folded and carried in his breast pocket until the paper had worn soft, then transferred to a small wooden box on the shelf in the workshop. He had taken it out sometimes in the first year and reread it, and he had been right every time he had thought about it. It was the most honest and inadvertently accurate account of another person he had ever read. She was difficult. She was headstrong. She was the most interesting person he had ever met, in the way that real things are always more interesting than easy things, in the way that the country out here was more interesting than the city he had left, vast and demanding, and full of a beauty that did not make any concessions to your comfort. He had read 2 paragraphs of a letter and packed his bag. It remained, without question, the best decision he had ever made. The valley outside the kitchen window was dark with November, and the stars were out in their extraordinary numbers, and the baby in his arms was small and warm and breathing with the profound commitment of someone who has recently arrived somewhere and is thoroughly engaged with the experience. And in the bedroom down the hall, Celia was sleeping the deep sleep of a woman who has done what she set out to do. And James and Frances were asleep in their room with the sounds of 2 small people who have decided to be unconscious for the time being. He rocked Robert in the kitchen and he thought, this room, this exact room, not the room where the furniture is pushed against the walls. This room, full in the middle, everything in its proper place, the whole shape of a life that fits around you like something made specifically for you, because you made it together, because you packed your bag and rode out on the Mesa Road and climbed a barn roof and stayed. He thought, as he sometimes did, about the people who had sold their land to the Callaway Company, who had taken the fair offers and moved on. He did not judge them. The territory was hard and the offers had been real, and everyone has their own calculus of what is worth holding, and what is worth trading. He just thought, looking around the kitchen at the cabinet he had built, and the floor he had repaired, and the cradle in the corner that had held 2 children and was now home to a third, that the things worth holding are rarely the things that look like the best offer at the time. Sometimes the best thing is the barn with the damaged roof, and the woman on top of it who does not want your help, but does not say you cannot come in. The November night lay quiet over the valley, and the stars were out, and Robert Abbott Brenner slept in his father's arms in the warm kitchen. And in the morning Celia would be rested and would have opinions about the south fence and the accounts, and the state of the seedling trays in the greenhouse that Wesley had built for her in September. And James would want to ride, and Francis would want to know why everything was the way it was. And the day would be full and loud and complicated and entirely real. And Wesley Brenner, who had packed his bag before he finished reading the first page of a letter, who had ridden out on a Thursday morning on a borrowed horse to the homestead of a woman, described as the most headstrong and difficult creature in the territory, who had climbed her barn roof because there was work to be done, and he knew how to do it. Wesley Brenner sat in the kitchen with his youngest son and the lamp burning low, and the whole of his life spread around him like country you can see from a high place, all of it yours, all of it real, none of it anything like easy, and thought that he had not once, not for a single moment, wished for easy instead. He had wished when he was younger for something that would require the full measure of him. He had found it. He had found her. The lamp burned low and the baby slept and the stars were out over the valley, and in the morning Celia would come into the kitchen and put her hand against his face for a moment, the way she did sometimes in the mornings, brief and certain, and say his name with that particular weight that no one else had ever given it, and the day would begin. It would always begin. That was the thing about real things, they did not end. They kept going, through the hard seasons and the good ones, through the November nights and the spring mornings and the October celebrations, and the arguments about fence lines and north pastures and workshop dimensions, through children growing and work building and love that had no interest in being convenient or comfortable, but was entirely and absolutely committed to being present. He had packed his bag before he finished the first page. He would pack it again without hesitation. He would pack it every time.